Good afternoon, dear friends. I was asked, I have a presentation, but frankly, inspiring by our previous conversation, our previous session, I maybe skip presentation, although you can get it, it's just some formal numbers. I will try to talk about my understanding of current trends in global development and Russian development. Part of the story I have already mentioned. What I have already said today, you saw it was my basic approach, my basic understanding of the trends we have been facing with. But let me start with general, maybe in more detail, about general assessment of what has happened and the current trends in our development. First of all, analyzing this pandemic challenges, pandemic crisis, I would start with the point that it is not an economic crisis at all, not political crisis. It's an economic, political, social consequences of external shock to our social life. And you may have noticed that in many paper studies, political speeches, there are various comparisons of this crisis or this challenge with our historical past, with different crises, with Great Depression of 1930s, sometimes with stagflation of 1970s. Those who lived in the West know it better than our compatriots. With crisis, a great recession of 2008, 2010. Of course, all these comparisons make sense, but what is more important is to compare, for analysis, for better understanding of this crisis, to compare it with war. Maybe particularly with World War I. You know, war is external shock. It's not about economics. Sometimes it's a mechanism of resolving of economic contradictions, of economic challenges, but war is external shock. And struggling against the enemy is very difficult and unpredictable task. And during these great wars, the features of new world are emerging. If you look at, why I think that it is important to compare it with war more than with purely economic crisis. Because, again, what is virus? Virus is like an alien headquarters. It has some plan. It has some elements of fight, armory, and we do not know how it will develop. From the very beginning, we do not know how to fight with them. We had intelligence service scientists, biologists, who tried to understand how it would work, how to fight him. We have the humanity. When I say we, it's not our country, it's human beings. We have army, doctors, medical servants who have to withstand to this danger. We have very clear economic consequences because we must restructure economic policy. Economic policy is changing. We have a shock on the side of supply because of because part of the economy of enterprises are closed, international trade is sharply stopped. So everything which usually follow the war, all typical economic consequences of the war, we see here, even the worst thing, the human victims. Moreover, from philosophical point of view, this is a existential choice, existential, because it is impossible to make it rationally, between economic victims and human victims. And we know they're interconnected, because you have to shut down economy to save some people. But you know then when you shut down the economy, you victimize some people who lose their income and do not have enough revenue even to survive. So it's very difficult. In any war in the 20th century, any government had this choice what to do, to save economy or to withstand. What is the level of acceptable victims to fight with the enemy? And different countries made their own choice, very different choice, from tough lockdowns like in, say, China or in some Asian countries. Swedish model, when they tried just to get accustomed to live with virus and to get the collective immunity as soon as herd immunity as soon as possible. Britain, which tried Swedish model and then shifted to tough lockdown. Intermediate decisions in most of European countries, which were very different and was a mixture between lockdown and maintaining economic activity. So what is important with this crisis is to comprehend that it is much more serious than economic crisis, and much less predictable, because actually you do not know what will be the result of war. Moreover, in any point of a national history, of international history, you faces with the different consequences of different decisions. For instance, at the beginning of World War I, at the beginning of World War II, it was a tough debate, for instance, in British government, when Prime Minister Churchill insisted that it should be a fight, the severe fight, and no resistance and no negotiations with the Nazi enemy. And Secretary on Foreign Affairs, Lord Hamilton, he believed that it's better to find common language with Nazis. In 1940, the arguments on the side of Churchill were weaker. 5 years later, people believed that Churchill was right and the fight against Nazis was important, no concession. But it was an existential choice. Churchill believed that a nation has to fight with this Nazi Black Death, I could say. So the same is about, on the other side of the story, is the technological changes. After this type of wars, like World War I and World War II, they accelerate social and economic and technological changes which had been accumulating in the previous peaceful periods. We spoke today about the digitalization and its role in human development, but the same was, for instance, with the growth of the growing role of the government, of the centralized regulation in the beginning of the 20th century, when many countries shifted from very low activity of the government in economy to very high. It could be measured by the share of government or taxes in GDP, which sharply increased in first 50 years of the 20th century. So the current situation is very much close to great wars of the 20th century, and it should be analyzed in these terms. We have economic consequences of external non-economic shock. It does mean that it should not be analyzed in economic terms. There are very important elements of economic policy to withstand this crisis, and different countries, various countries, demonstrated different results. At the beginning, it was, well, a year and a half ago, say in February 2020, it was very difficult to perceive how a situation would develop. What economic policy should be used? Should we stimulate the economy? Should we inflate it to bring more money? Should we restrict it? Who should be supported? People or businesses? So it was just a blank list, blank paper, where politicians, economists, social workers didn't have clear understanding of what has to be done. After a year of pandemic, I will show you some. Does it work? Look at this picture. You can hear two graphs. The level of spending as percentage to GDP and economic performance, growth or contracting, in most cases contracting of GDP. You could see here that Russia, for instance, was quite successful from this point of view. Not very sharp decrease, and not very strong spending. At least if we put here another column of, say, budget deficit or debt to GDP, you would see that, for instance, in Russia, debt to GDP was still very low, one of the lowest in the world, about 16% of GDP. While, say, in Japan, it's more than 250% of GDP. In the States, it's more than 100% of GDP. But it is quite stable economy. And we see here that it was very difficult to work out any single model or single vehicle, how to fight, how to withstand to economic consequences of this crisis. Another important point to understand with this crisis and fighting it is that economically the crisis started as a shock of supply. It's very important, again, those who are not economists may not get it, but even many economists do not understand it. It's common sense, quite widespread in the world, that if crisis happens, it's important to put more money to the economy. But we know that in some cases, when you put more money, you have inflation and you have sharp increase of prices. In some cases, you have sharp increase of inequality. In some cases, it stimulates growth. And it was very important to grasp what is the source of this crisis, what are the important features for this crisis, what is the diagnosis of this crisis to fight with it. I mean now about economic part of this crisis. And it's very important to bear in mind that this crisis economically started with the shock of supply, not with the shock of demand. When, say, 2008, 2010, Great Recession, or 1930s Great Depression, there was a crisis of demand. And we know that to overcome painful consequences of this crisis, it was enough to spur more money into the economy. And if it is a crisis of supply, you get more money, economy responds by producing more commodities to the supply, and everything going more or less smoothly. Of course, there are some problems with macroeconomics, say either debt, state government debt increases or budget deficit, but we know how to solve it more or less. But when it is a crisis of supply, if you print more money, economy cannot respond in it by more commodities, because either enterprises are closed, as it is during lockdown, or borders for international trade is closed. So something like this happened in the 1970s. This crisis, global crisis, less known than 1930s or last decade, but 1970s was the first period in global history when the world, particularly developed world, faced with the problem with stagflation. It had never happened before. Stagflation means inflation with stagnation. Normally in economic development, if inflation is growing, economy is growing, and unemployment is going down. If deflation happens, prices are stable or go down, economy is going down, unemployment is increasing. Stagflation means very strange situation, but we understand now how it works when economic crisis is followed by inflation, by sharp increase in prices. And that was one of the important dangers, and this is one of the problems the global economy is facing now, because after this strong imprinting money into the economy, we have increased inflation. It's interesting topic. In previous 10 years, the main concern of most of developed economies was deflation. It was very low inflation and very low growth rate. Now we have increasing growth rate, but with sharp increasing of inflation. And we shall see how it will work further. But it's also a part of problems of war economy, because high inflation is with a low growth rate or negative growth rates is typical to military economy. When economy is when warfare dismantles enterprises, and the crisis of supply also emerges. So this is one of the stories. Part of the stories. Another interesting point from this picture, from this table, is one of the reasons of there are several reasons why Russian performance is relatively good. One is, I mentioned that Russian macroeconomic policy, I did mention, Russian macroeconomic policy in previous 10 years was very cautious. Russian government and Russian central bank was very careful about debt policy, about budget, fiscal policy. Russian debt was very low, about 15% of GDP, and mostly nominated in national currency. Only about 2% of Russian debt of GDP was in international currency. Russian budget was mostly balanced, inflation was curbed, so macroeconomic situation was quite positive. Another reason of this relatively good economic performance in previous year or two is, in economy, as in our life, sometimes negative features become positive. In previous 20 years, everybody complained that small business was not very active in this country, that we didn't have enough small business in terms of workforce, in terms of GDP, but that was one of the sources of this positive result. Because, of course, a small business is much more vulnerable in situation of crisis, pandemic crisis, than big business. And when you do not have much small business, you do not need strong money to support it, and you do not have strong contraction. So these numbers is also part, it's a regional structure of Russian economy. And it turned out quite positive in this situation. speaking about prospect, about further economic development, about not only Russia, but about the world, I wanted to stress, to point out several problems, several points, or if you like, contradictions. One is that the world 10 years ago, 15 years ago, approached a structural crisis. Actually, great recession of 2008-2010 was structural global crisis. But the world and most of the developed countries, including Russia, were able to bail out structural crisis, to pay a lot of money and to avoid structural crisis, to keep structure as it was. To some extent, this pandemic crisis accelerates structural problems, structural changes in the economy. And we're approaching very serious structural changes based on digitalization. We do not know detail, but what we do know that digitalization brings about substantial changes in most of the sectors of economic and social life. Here we discussed mostly the consequences for education. And as a rector of this academy, I do believe that we cannot, even if pandemic virus disappears overnight or in foreseeable future, will not come back to traditional mechanism of learning, because we have tasted, we have tried distance learning, and we see that in some cases it works better. Not in any case. It doesn't mean that everything will be in distance, but we see that there are some elements that we will have to structurally change, to change the structure of educational process. We have to test, we have already tested, and we shall continue it, where distance is better. Education is not only lecturing and workshop. Say, admission process. Last year, in 2020, we had more than 90% of admission online. Only tiny group came physically. We keep this opportunity to come physically and to bring the papers in physical terms to our admission commission, but we understand that vast majority will come online, either directly through our admission electronic system or through so-called gosuslugi, state service system. But it will definitely dominate. We have to make up our mind what to do with those who are vaccinated and non-vaccinated, how separate them, what to do with teaching staff, with services, with students. We have some instruments how to press teachers to vaccinate, but we do not have, frankly speaking, the mechanism what to do with students. And we have to make this decision whether we put everybody online in distance or not. It's really a serious structural choice, not short-term, but long-term choice. We see that some programs, for instance, MBA or MPA programs, they prefer to postpone the courses, but to have it in person. And it's understandable because in the programs, postgraduate programs, the personal contacts are even more important than contacts with the teachers, with professors, even with very experienced teachers. In bachelor level, maybe of course, socialization is important, but the good professor online is often better, to my mind, than bad professor in the audience. We are discussing the structure of educational process. what will happen with the education process. The same is with medicine. The same is with online commerce. It's quite clear that many people shifted to booking foodstuff, a lot of commodities, and they will not come back to the shops. What will happen with the shop, with department stores? Will it be a part of quasi-luxury exhibition with cinemas as it used to be with the malls? Or what will happen with all this stuff? What will happen with medicine? Because medicine have faced very serious challenge, and to my mind, it's a big question about prospects of insurance in medicine. Basically, there are two basic models. The state-sponsored medicine, Soviet type, so-called Simashka type. The first minister of health in the Soviet Union was Nikolai Simashka, and he created the medical system, which was very successful for poor country where vast majority, when the bulk of population didn't, sorry, it's not digital. The bulk of population didn't have access to medicine. Now, if pandemic becomes important, I think that this model would play some important role. And one of the reasons why we didn't have, at least we haven't had recently, severe crisis in medical system is because we still had the remnants of beds. These elements of Soviet medicine, when there were clinics with maybe not very good quality of medical support, but with a lot of places in hospitals just to stay, and this part of this negative tradition played its positive role. Another important question is the prospects, very important question, is the prospects of the role of the government. If you look at last 200 years, you would see that it was different stages and we changed the role of the government. It was a liberal approach in the 19th century, centralization with a sharp increase of budget to GDP in most of the countries in the first half of the 20th century. It's enough to say that, for instance, is 1900, budget to GDP in the developed world was between 3% in the United States and 12% in Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, it was 12% not because of its intervention to economy, but because it had Asian border of Russia was much more dangerous than Canadian border in the United States. It was mostly about military issues and not about economic intervention. After World War II, the same numbers were 64-65% in the Soviet Union and, by the way, Sweden, socialist country, and about 30% in the United States. But it was a radically different economy. Then, after stagflation, after the global crisis of 1970s, many countries decreased its rate of budget to GDP, rate of taxation, and it was quite successful period too. But now everybody see, and in the 1989, well-known by that time and still now, American philosopher Francis Fukuyama even published an article called The End of History, declaring that by this time the liberal market and liberal capitalism demonstrated its superiority, and that now we know what is efficient in the world. 30 years from that time, we see that the trend has changed again. Government is playing a bigger role, and both in terms of taxation and social policy. But what is important is that it doesn't mean that the world is going back to the life as it was 100 years ago. now it's very interesting to understand the source of this increasing role of the government. 100 years ago, government played bigger role because technology world was predictable. In, say, 1900, 1910, 1920, it was easy to know what were industrial priorities. It was easy to know what should be key industries, development of which creates the political and military superiority of the country. Heavy industry, metallurgy, etc., etc. So it was predictable. Moreover, when you had to put an end to the world where many people are very poor and others are rich, it was enough to redistribute means of living between the world to make it. When you had millions of people who didn't have dinner and those who had a few who had a lot of dinner, you knew how to redistribute it. But when people are more or less satisfied with their basic needs, and when structure is more important, structure of consumption is more important than the very fact of basic existence of the people, you have completely different political economy, if you understand what I mean. But nowadays, the situation is quite opposite. The world is extremely unpredictable. And in this case, government cannot say what is priority. Government have to compensate this unpredictability. We live in the world where in many countries investment is substantially less than their savings, than accumulation. Normally, they should be equal. I have here this picture. Let's stay without pictures. But in many, we live in the world where there is a lot of money. In previous 15 years, central banks printed a lot of money without severe inflation. And investment is low. It means, well, if it were only a situation in Russia, we could complain about investment climate, these typical problems. But it's the situation typical for many countries. And the source of this problem is technological unpredictability. Many investors just do not know what to do with money to have revenue and not losses in the period of investment. And it means that government has to play a role of investor of last resort. 20 years ago, many economists would have said that government should not borrow money, government should not invest because it replaces efficient private investment by inefficient government investment. Now, this argument doesn't work because the choice is between inefficient government investment and no investment. Because private business is not very keen to invest in everything which is not short-term with short-term revenue. And it creates another very important challenge to many governments. Next problem is inequality. Inequality is not just well, there are. When speaking about inequality, I don't mean that it's bad when some people are getting more richer than others. When inequality is growing, when then well-being of everybody is growing, it's not a big deal. The problem starts when part of the population, the smaller part of the population, is getting rich, and the rest is stagnating or getting poor. But it's rare case that getting poor. Normally, when the low part is stagnating and the rich are getting rich. The result of monetary policy of last 10 years, one of the negative results. The positive is that we avoided crisis and avoided sharp unemployment in most of the countries. But the negative part of the story is that, as we see it now, most of the printed money went not to the consumption, but to accumulation, to financial market, not to commodity market, but to financial market. As a result, and you see it was paradoxical situation in previous 10 years when consumer price index was, grew very low or stagnated. We had very low inflation and very high inflation in financial market. But what does it mean in social terms? It means that the income from property, those who get income from property became richer than those who get income from labor. Wages do not work, but income from assets, from property has been growing. Of course, it creates a lot of problems, political problems, and the rise of populism is the very clear consequence of this really a situation which is considered as unjust, and it is unjust. But it's also a result of macroeconomic policy, and as it often happens in political economy, the good wishes results in bad consequences, because this money was printed to avoid unemployment, to avoid severe economic crisis, but result was growing inequality with the political crisis and political concerns. So there are main challenges which we have to understand, to grasp, to work about. And let me stop on this point, and I think it's better if I answer your questions, if you have questions. Question on any topic, of course, regarding economic policy and not, say, about medicine, which I know less. Please.
Vladimir Alexandrovich, здравствуйте. Okay, I'll talk in English. My name is Anna Kosarukova. I'm from Moscow campus, and I mostly have a question about education because I'm a future human resource specialist, and this is important for me. So, main trait of our generation is getting the fast result, getting fast success, and with all these shift to distance learning, we have the problem that, not the problem, the opportunity that there are a lot of online schools getting into the market like Netologia, Skillbox, and so on. And these give people the opportunity to get the profession really, really fast, much cheaper, less emotional, and maybe more structured. And how will this affect the higher education? Will this change the number of years we get our bachelor or the structure of the whole course of education? How this specialist will grow and how this will affect the labor market? So those who get education from online school and those who got the education in the university. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. First of all, it is your choice, because different people choose different personal track of their education and development. As a university, we do collaborate with both institutions mentioned by you, I mean, Netologia and Skillbox. We have joint programs. We're collaborating in different areas. But again, you see, it is different strategy, and it very much depends on personal choice. Some people prefer a stable university education with fundamental knowledge. Others prefer to go to quick getting results. But in this case, you will have to come back to these results again and again. It's like, say, a role of, you could also ask to what extent university will exist, because now half of the pupils from the 9th year in school go not to the 10th form, but to professional, vocational training for professional education, to colleges. It's also quite normal. Many of them come back to the university. The same will be with Skillbox. So it's good when there are many options. But it is your responsibility what pattern you choose. I think that the smaller short-term programs will also diversify it into the better quality and worse quality. You know, this is a different demand. Some in the educational market, some people prefer cheap and worse. Well, there is no, what is important, there is no such a thing like cheap and good. Good quality commodity and service is expensive. We have to, and when I say expensive, not necessarily in money, in terms of years in school. Education is investment. And you could invest in different investment projects. It could be a big bank, if you are dreaming to have a big bank, and it could be a bakery, which is much cheaper and gives short-term revenue, but maybe less stable. But sometimes even more stable, because people would buy bakery every day. So it's all the things is individual choice. There is no such a thing that either or. To those who know Soviet movies, I would remind the film «Москва слезам не верит». It's quite famous in Russian movie where one of the heroes in late 50s says he started to work in TV station, saying that 20 years from now there will be no more arts, neither theater nor cinema, only TV. 20 years later, he comes to the same lady and repeats the same. Well, if you have television, it doesn't mean that theater will disappear. This is what I wanted to say. Вот, молодой, вот можно, вот молодой человек первым вообще поднял руку.
Thank you, Vladimir Alexandrovich. I have a question as a sociologist, and my question about social economic policy. You talked about inequality, but if we will look to other issues from some scientists, there are many parts of segregation of inequality, not in a financial, but in a gender, in age after the coronavirus. And my question about, have our country, our state resources not just to develop the digital, develop the other resources, but to help for the lower classes with the underagers and others, which are in the problem in this period, and if not, what the priority will be?
Well, fighting poverty is a very important priority, but first of all, I would say maybe politically wrong thing, but I'm not a politician. I don't know what does it mean justice. Что такое справедливость? What is just for one group of people is unjust to others. And justice is very social and, using Marx's term, class approach. It very much depends from which point of view you discuss as justice. For instance, let me give you one example. 100 years ago, those who are richer, more rich people worked less than poor people. It was unjust. Rich people worked less. If you look at sociologists, the situation now, you would see that rich people normally work much harder and much more. Moreover, rich people now are, in vast majority, are self-made people, and not those who inherited their fortune from their aristocratic predecessors. So is it just or unjust? If a person is smart enough, strong enough, and courageous enough to make proper decisions and become rich, is it just or unjust? Should he or she give his money to others? Who would say that government would better give its money to solve national global problems than rich people, many of whom create funds and try to participate in solution of global important problems. So, of course, government have to help those who are unable to be successful. Moreover, I would say that even the basic, what seem to be basic principles or institutions could change. For instance, I think that in your generation, age pension, would become a special payment to those who are poor or unsuccessful. Because, many of the people, even of my generation, minus 10 years, they already do not think how to live on their state pension. They think how to create the proper style of life when they're getting old. They rely on themselves, because government can give only minor part of what people are accustomed to live. When we discuss, for instance, pension system, we should not forget that current state pension system, not only in Russia, in many developed countries, were created when pension age was substantially higher than life expectancy. When Soviet Union created its pension system, total pension system in 1930s, life expectancy was 45 years of age, and pension age was 55 for women and 62 men. It's completely it's like, and it was quite good pension for those who survived till their pension age. But to have such a good pension, we have now to say that pension age should be 80 years. In this case, it would be a big, solid pension. Just to understand that situation has been changing substantially. Understand me, I'm not for increase of pension age to such a level. I'm just saying that when you say that your grandmothers or grandfathers got much better pension than now, let's not forget that it was completely different demographic situation. So government have to, first of all, government have to respond to people's needs. For some people, for instance, there are countries where people prefer to pay 90% personal income tax, up to 90%, but to have huge social funds, and government which provides even the free taxi for elderly people. There are some countries who prefer to pay less taxes and be less dependent on the government decision. So it very much depends. What is just, to a large extent, very much depends on what are people in this country consider as just, and for which justice they are ready to pay. And it's very important, because you may say that I wanted to have everything free of charge but pay no income tax. It doesn't work.
Okay. Good evening, Vladimir Alexandrovich. My name is Yana Kurdyukova, and I want to ask a question. What of the communicational tools does require the most attention in the modern world? And I have one more optional question. Which of them will be able to have a positive impact on the international economy?
Sorry, could you repeat? I haven't grasped you. You mean what communication? What?
Communicational tools.
For what?
For the economy.
I don't know. What are communication tools? Conversation, I believe. What do you mean by communication tools?
Каналы коммуникации.
All possible channels.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Vladimir Alexandrovich. My name is Svetlana Susina, and I'm from Moscow campus, and I want to ask you a question. Well, as we know, the transfer policy of the Ministry of Finance has provided serious support to the regions with weak economies during the crisis, but as we know, it is not enough. And in this case, I have a question. Have maybe new tools been developed to deal with the crisis based on economic characteristics of the regions? Thank you.
Well, first of all, any assistance is not enough. I can't imagine the situation when the recipients of the financial support would say that it's enough for them. But in this case, it's another question that sometimes it could be what is considered as just one region is unjust for others. For instance, why normally those who pursue more reasonable, more cautious economic policy, budget policy, collect taxes, they get less support than those who are poor and demonstratively poor. I do not try who raises a lot of debts and then say that they would need more support. So it's quite controversial, quite controversial issue. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Tife. So I'm an economics student, and I noticed over the chart you showed us, of all the countries, only China and Turkey has a positive GDP. So I'd like to ask, from your point of view, why that is so, what they did, and in the case of other economic shifts, how we can apply these statistics and principles to micro businesses, startups, and small, medium enterprises. Thank you.
Frankly speaking, we do not know what happens, in fact, in China. And nobody knows. But don't forget that this growth rate is for China, which had 6 to 10%, 7 to 10% in previous years, is like negative rate in because in many developed countries. This is first point. But again, I don't know. Frankly, I do not know. The same about Turkey, as you mentioned. It very much depends on ability, for instance, to accept the number of victims. We would not know what was happening in China during the pandemic and how it worked. Really, I don't know. I do understand what was happening, say, in the States, in Britain. It's much more transparent and much more clear, but not what happened in China. And how did they get these numbers? Well, stop applauding. I didn't say anything wise, by the way. I just said that I do not know.
Hello, Vladimir Alexandrovich. I'm from Aral Branch. My name is Anastasia.
Sorry, from?
Aral Branch. And my question is, during pandemic, we can see a list of countries, and from your personal opinion, what country has chosen the most successful politics for pandemic period? Thank you.
Maybe Northern Korea, because we do not know what happened there. They see that there was no one who was ill. Well, what is more success? Successful is the politics which is supported by the people. And you know, look at Sweden. It was a period when everybody was praying, was saying the Swedish way was the best. But then it was a period in the second half of last year when many people said compare with Finland and Norway, and you would see that more victims. Now Swedish way again is considered as very positive. Who knows? There is no single criteria to say which was successful. Vietnam had very successful, but again, I would not know what precisely there was. Vietnam. Look, Singapore was very successful, but the result was, but now they completely shifted and announced, the government announced that they would consider coronavirus as a flu and stopped any restrictions. It was very successful, Iceland. But it's a country with about 300,000 people where everybody knew each other and was very careful and they separated island. So it, we will be able to analyze successful policy after the end of this drama. Now in first stage, Russia was quite successful. I mean, the first pandemic wave, spring, it was very, in terms of price quality, in terms of investment, spending to result, it was successful. According to these numbers, China is successful. But again, it will be a question to economic historians at the end of the day, not now. Please. Not.
Good day. Thank you for a very interesting lecture you're giving to us today. So, according to these numbers, China's GDP is growing in comparison to our countries, in comparison to our European countries. So my question, but in China, the government plays a very big role. So in your opinion, will European countries use this Chinese approach and allow the government play a bigger role in the economic or not? Thank you.
You know, you are not quite right. For instance, in China, as far as I remember, the budget to GDP, the consolidated budget, around 25%. In most European countries is between 40 and 50% of GDP. It's a mistake to believe that in China, Communist Party plays important administrative role. But if you can imagine that Communist Party will come to power in European states and will play the role of Chinese Communist Party, it's nonsense, because people do not accept it. But in strict economic terms, economic role of the governments in European countries is much stronger than in China. China, in economic terms, is much more liberal economy. Because China doesn't have full-scale pension system, full-scale state medicine, education, etc. It's not about intervention just into the industrial enterprises. It's about a role in the national development. So it's a myth that China has a very strong state, but it's a politically strong state. It's single-party system. My question is whether Britain or Germany or France will accept single-party system and dictatorship for the sake of better coronavirus performance, of course, no. How could you imagine this?
Good afternoon. My name is Vaskanyan Tatiana. I'm from Moscow campus of RANEPA. And I would like to ask you a question about new model of economic growth. You know, our export raw material model is rather outdated. So what could you suggest for our new model?
Well, we produce what is good on international markets. By the way, we are a big exporter not only of raw materials but also of agricultural products, of chemistry, of course, military-industrial complex. So it's more complicated. We're less dependent on rent payment than it used to be. But again, work hard and increase labor productivity and quality. There is no special economic model. There is, the country could sell what it can produce effectively. That's it. It's not about a special economic model. Produce commodities of better quality and lower price and sell. Of course, there are a lot of special restrictions connected with so-called carbonic trace, etc. But basically, just do more competitive commodities and services. How to do it? It's art of economic policy, and it's a lot of things, ideas, how it is to be done. But if demand for raw materials exists, it's strange to expect that country will stop selling it. Коллеги, решайте, я же не регулирую. I'm not regulating this process.
Hello, so my name is Azalia. I am from Ufa and studying in Kazan Federal University. I have actually two questions, and one is connected to the economical system. And so we can compare systems with the big businesses to a watermelon. So once crisis happens, it might just crack. And the systems where we have small businesses with the grapes. So it falls and only the down grapes are cracked and the ones on the top are okay. So I didn't quite get how our system with the big businesses survived, and don't you think that if we had more support on small businesses, that would work a little bit better, maybe? So what's your opinion? And the second question is about the vaccination. What do you think went so wrong that people don't want to get vaccinated when Europeans are begging to get that vaccine? Thanks.
Well, the key problem in any economic and political system is definitely trust or confidence. And if people, well, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know why people do not like vaccination. Psychological, I think, problem. Lack of confidence to government recommendation. A lot of reasons why it could be. So again, I'm not a psychologist, but it's rather surprising. I couldn't even explain it by lack of competition, because in a Western country there is no big competition between vaccines, it's more shortages. Maybe according to Russian tradition, but again, it's psychology, and I'm not a specialist in psychology. In Russian tradition, when government recommends something and you could access to this, it creates some doubts. It's better if government says that it's in shortage, you could not get it, you have to stay in line, and better to pay bribe to get this commodity. It works better. It works better. Maybe this is part of the story. Vaccine is really acceptable. About, you asked about small business or what?
Do you think that still would work in our country and maybe it even would do better?
Work what?
If government supported small businesses more?
Oh, well, no, no. I don't believe that small business. Well, I would say, again, politically incorrect. I don't believe in business which needs support of the government. If business needs support of the government, it's not business. Of course, in the crisis time, it's important to support people, not business. And by the way, this is an interesting difference between American or Anglo-Saxon approach to anti-crisis policy and European or social democratic. In the States or Britain, government mostly supports families and people, not businesses. And because if structural reconstruction is needed, it's better if inefficient companies close down. And it's very important to support people and not companies, even small business companies, because business had to adjust to the structure. In most of European countries, it was more support of businesses, particularly small business, to give money to small firms, to maintain employment. And this is the difference, very interesting difference, that in liberal economies, government supports people and not businesses. In social democratic economies, government supports businesses and less people.
So I still have a question though. For example, we had one support when...
No, sorry, it should be either microphone or not. And we had to have some more people.
Does it work? Government gave 10,000 rubles to the families with kids smaller than, I don't know, some age, and those money, they were just gone. And if government supported businesses, small businesses, people would make money working there.
Why would they make money if other people not buy their services of commodities? Why? Why?
They would buy with the delivery and something.
Well, you need some support, because if people are unemployed or their works close down, it's temporary support. It's not long-term support. But imagine, business exists to make money. Business which need government support, not institutionally government support of money, is not business at the very end of the story. Of course, in some rare cases, of course, it is crisis. Again, business is to be supported to avoid sharp increase in unemployment, but not business for business. Well, maybe we have philosophically different positions, but I understand why government has to support their people who are their taxpayers. People pay to the government, actually. Government exists for the money which these people pay. But to support businesses which are inefficient and need government support, it's strange. To take taxes from one people and give it to business. I can't understand that. I understand if this business people become unemployed, they get government support. Unlucky, crisis. To support people, well, again, there are some cases, like pandemic, where it's worth it to support businesses to wait, because sometimes it's more difficult. Well, when it is not structural, when it is not economic, but political, pandemic shock. I understand why it should be business should be supported, because the crisis is not because they're inefficient, but because it is locked down, because they're prohibited from work. But basically, normal economic consequences, for me, support business instead of support people is a very strange idea.
Hello, my name is Leet and I'm from South Africa. Okay. Again, my name is Leet and I'm from South Africa. And my question is, how do you feel about emerging economies looking to cryptocurrencies as a way to drive the recoveries from the economic fallout of the virus?
Sorry, I can.
Okay.
Its sound is not very good.
Okay.
Economic what?
How do you feel about the emerging economies looking to cryptocurrencies as a way to drive the recoveries from the economic fallout of the virus?
Well, but cryptocurrency is a completely different story. It's, well, we don't know what are the prospects of cryptocurrencies. It's completely new political economy. And, virus is separate story. Cryptocurrency is not way out of virus crisis, to my mind. It's more technological challenge. Moreover, I would recommend to separate cryptocurrencies and electronic currencies, which central banks are going to issue. It's two very different stories, but it needs very special discussion on this topic.
Hello, my name is Taonga from Zambia. I'm curious about something. Recently, I read that the world is in debt. It has $281 trillion in debt. So I'd like to find out, who is the world in debt to?
Who? Sorry?
Who is the world in debt to?
Well, it's quite, you understand that it's quite virtual debt, because it's debt based on printed money. But what type of, who in the world is in debt? Once again.
Okay. I read that...
Yes,
yes.
That's a huge global debt.
Yes. So it said that the world is in debt of $281 trillion. So I wanted to find out, who does the world owe, or who are we in debt to?
Well, those countries which issue the global currencies. But these countries are also in debt. The countries are in debt to each other. Of course, they're in debt to each other because, say, United States covers its budget deficit, huge budget deficit, by printing their own money. Since other countries trust in this money, they collect this money. Of course, this is there are some countries, say, like China, which keeps substantial part of American debt, but in American currency. You understand that it is very, this is a very good question, because it is those who keep American treasury bills, they are debtors. But on the other hand, those who issue, they're creditors, sorry, but those who issue American dollars, they issue credit money. So they issue credit and debt simultaneously. And this is quite paradoxical situation. You know that the first Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, when dollar crisis, or the Bretton Woods system crisis emerged in 1971, said, and when many countries complained that Americans didn't follow their obligation based on Bretton Woods system, said that that US dollar is our currency and your problem. American currency, but your problems of those who keep their reserves in American currency. Well, I'm afraid that we have to complete.
Shall we have the final question? One more, or no? Vladimir Alexandrovich,
yes.
Can we have one more question?
Yes, of course.
Sam, you wanted to ask? Yeah?
I've enjoyed their asking the economic historian to predict the future. And you talked earlier about the minority being right. Is there a prediction that you have about the future that you think most people would disagree with you about? Or is there something during the pandemic that you got completely wrong and you've been really surprised that's happened?
I'm an economic historian, so I have a preference to speak from the future to the past. I mentioned it, let me repeat. I said at the first our session that I was very much surprised that something happened in the world more radical than a crash of communism. And to my mind, digitalization, and iPhone is a symbol of digitalization, had much stronger impact on the global development than clash of communism. And it was really surprising for me. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best. I hope that I do believe that you will like this campus because all previous 8 generations, 8 groups of your predecessors really liked it very much. And thank you very much. Thank you, and thank those who organized it, because although this is a campus of Presidential Academy of RANEPA, I play a tiny role a very small role, almost zero role in organization of this campus. This is a thanks to Natalia, to Ivan, to all those people who will be working with you here on behalf of our academy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.